All right, TalkTicker listeners, you asked for it, so we're delivering. We're diving deep into Freeport McMoran's Q3 2024 earnings call today. We've got the official release right here, but we're going to go way beyond those headlines, straight into the heart of the analyst Q&A, because that's where things get really interesting. Ready to use your copper knowledge on?
Absolutely. And, I think what's fascinating here is we're not just looking at numbers. Like in a vacuum, Freeport's performance needs to be understood against this backdrop of global copper prices, and they've been anything but stable lately.
Okay, so paint that picture for me. What's been going on with copper prices?
Well, picture a tug of war, right? On
Right.
one side, you've got this massive surge in demand for copper, driven by electrification of everything, EVs, renewable energy, you name it. But on the other side, you have all these economic headwinds. China's slow down the Fed's interest rate hikes, and that creates uncertainty, volatility in the market.
Got it. So Freeport's trying to ride this copper wave. And from their press release, it sounds like they're doing pretty well. They're touting, strong operating performance, beating sales estimates for both copper and gold, and even managing to keep their unit net cash cost lower than expected.
Yeah, that's right. And those lower costs are especially noteworthy. It suggests that their efforts to improve efficiency, really squeeze more out of their existing operations, are actually paying off.
But before we get too carried away with all this good news, there's that whole issue with the fire at their new smelter in Indonesia. That's going to be a problem, right?
It's definitely a setback. The timing couldn't be worse. The smelter was just weeks away from being fully operational, and, it's a cornerstone of their long-term strategy in Indonesia.
Okay, so remind us why this smelter is so important. It's not just about shiny new equipment, is it?
No, not at all. See, Indonesia has these regulations that make it tricky to export raw, unprocessed copper concentrate. They want companies to invest in downstream processing within their borders, adding value to those natural resources before they're shipped out.
So this smelter was Freeport's way of saying, hey, Indonesia, we're playing by the rules. We're investing in your economy. We're here for the long haul.
Exactly. And it ties directly into their long-term operating rights in the Grasberg mine, which is one of the largest copper and gold deposits on the planet.
Wow.
Those rights are set to expire in 2041, and this smelter was a big part of securing an extension.
Okay, so this fire is a major headache. But let's not forget, they did post some seriously impressive financials this quarter. I mean, their operating cash flow was a whopping $1.9 billion. And for the full year, they're projecting $6.8 billion, which is just mind-blowing.
Those are some big numbers, but remember, they're not just pulling those out of thin air. Those projections are based on certain assumptions about copper and gold prices, $4.25 per pound for copper and $2,600 per ounce for gold.
Which is where the analyst Q&A gets juicy.
Right.
I mean, those analysts are paid to be skeptical, to poke holes in those rosy projections and see if they hold water.
Exactly. And there were definitely some pointed questions about those price assumptions and, whether they're realistic given the current market volatility.
So let's dig into that Q&A and see what nuggets of wisdom we can unearth. What were some of the key concerns that analysts raised? What were the big questions they were throwing at Freeport's management?
So one thing that jumped out at me was this discussion around insurance coverage, for the smelter outage, specifically whether they have what's called business interruption coverage.
Okay, and what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, it means that if they can't operate the smelter, because of this fire, the insurance would help to cover their lost revenue. But guess what?
What?
They don't have that coverage.
Ouch. So that's a big financial hit then. On top of the repair costs. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Exactly. And the analysts were definitely drilling down on, how much this could potentially cost Freeport, especially if it leads to delays in, exporting that copper concentrate. Remember those Indonesian regulations we talked about?
Right. They're in a tough spot. They need that smelter to be up and running smoothly to appease the Indonesian government and keep those copper exports flowing. What else were the analysts worried about?
A lot of questions about this $1 billion in restricted cash that Freeport has tied up in Indonesia.
$1 billion? What's going on there? Is it just sitting in some vault gathering dust?
Not quite. It's a direct result of those export regulations we keep talking about. Indonesia requires 30% of all export proceeds to be held in Indonesian banks for 90 days.
No.
So it's not like Freeport can't access the money. It's just that it creates, a temporary drag on their liquidity.
So it's like having a chunk of your paycheck frozen for 3 months. Annoying, but, you'll eventually get it.
Exactly. It's not a permanent loss, but it does limit their financial flexibility in the short term. And the analysts wanted to understand, how that might impact their ability to invest in growth projects or even return value to shareholders.
Okay, so we've got insurance headaches and cash flow quirks. Anything else keeping those analysts up at night?
Well, there was a lot of skepticism about Freeport's, ambitious cost reduction plans. They're
Yeah.
talking about achieving these, significant savings. But the analysts were like, show me the receipts. They've heard this song before and they want to see evidence that this time is different.
It's fair enough. They're not just going to take Freeport's word for it.
Yeah.
So what's the plan? How are they hoping to achieve these cost savings?
They're looking at everything from boosting asset productivity and optimizing operations to reducing, reliance on contractors and even negotiating harder with their suppliers. It's a multi-pronged approach, but it remains to be seen whether they can execute effectively.
Sounds like a lot of moving parts and a lot of potential for things to, slip through the cracks.
Absolutely. And the analysts were basically saying, we're not convinced until we see tangible results. They're looking for proof, not promises.
Okay, so we've delved into the nitty-gritty financials and the skeptical scrutiny of those analysts. But beyond the numbers, there's some really interesting tidbits that came out of this call. What caught your ear?
Something that stood out to me was their discussion of this REACH initiative. Sounds a bit like corporate jargon, but it's actually pretty fascinating. They're basically using technology to optimize their existing mines to, squeeze out more copper without necessarily digging new holes in the ground.
Okay, so it's like getting more juice out of the orange rather than finding a whole new orange tree.
Exactly. And they've already achieved a run rate of 200 million pounds of additional copper per year through REACH. And they're aiming for a whopping 800 million.
Wow, that's a serious boost in production. And it ties into this bigger trend we've been seeing in the mining industry, doing more with less,
Right.
being more efficient and sustainable.
Right. It's not just about digging up more resources. It's about using technology to optimize what they already have. And it makes sense, especially given the growing concerns about, resource scarcity and environmental impact.
Speaking of the future, Freeport also outlined a whole bunch of growth projects they're considering. Places where they're thinking about putting their money to work and expanding their copper empire. Let's break those down because it's a pretty diverse portfolio.
Sure. There's the potential expansion of their Baghdad mine in Arizona, a massive new project called Lone Star, potentially in the same region, a huge new concentrator project at El Abra in Chile in partnership with Codelco. And then there's the long-term development of the Kuncing Liar deposit in Indonesia.
Okay, so they're not just sitting on their laurels. They're actively looking for ways to grow their production capacity. But how do we decipher which of these projects are likely to actually happen and which are just pie in the sky?
Well, based on their comments, a decision on that Baghdad expansion seems pretty imminent. I think they're expecting to make a call next year. So that one's definitely high on the list. And then the Lone Star pre-feasibility study is still underway, but they're talking about potentially doubling production there, which would be huge.
Yeah, and then there's El Abra, this mega project with Codelco aiming for 750 million pounds of annual copper production plus molybdenum. That sounds like a serious commitment.
Yeah, it is, but it also has a much longer timeline, partly due to permitting, in Chile. It's like a 7 to 8 year project.
Yeah.
So they're making a bet on that long-term demand for copper remaining strong.
Got it. So that one's more of a slow burn. And let's not forget about the Kuncing Liar development in Indonesia. It's not expected to start producing until 2030. But it has a reserve life all the way to 2041, and they think possibly even beyond that.
That's right. And it really highlights, Freeport's long-term vision, especially in Indonesia. They're not just thinking about the next few years.
Yeah.
They're looking decades ahead.
Okay, so we've got these ambitious growth plans, but also this backdrop of global economic uncertainty and the ever-present political complexities of operating in Indonesia. It's a lot to
It is, and that's why it's so important to look beyond the headlines, to understand the nuances of, the analyst Q&A, and to really grasp those risks and opportunities facing Freeport.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. What does all this mean for our listeners? For those who are thinking about investing in Freeport or just curious about the future of copper.
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is that Freeport's playing this long game, but with some pretty significant short-term hurdles, in their path.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to build this copper castle, but there's a fire-breathing dragon, lurking nearby.
That's a great analogy. I think what's particularly striking is this contrast between their challenges in Indonesia and their, bullishness on copper demand overall. On one hand, you've got this smelter setback, the uncertainty surrounding their operating rights beyond 2041, and those ever-present political risks of doing business in, a country like Indonesia.
Right. It's a high-stakes game they're playing there. But at the same time, they're pouring billions into growth projects around the world, betting big on this idea that copper will be the metal of the future.
Exactly. And they're not alone in that belief. The electrification trend is only gaining momentum, and that means we're going to need a lot more copper in the coming years. The question is, can Freeport overcome those short-term hurdles and position themselves to, ride that copper wave?
So for our listeners who are maybe thinking about adding some Freeport to their portfolio, what's the key takeaway here? What should they be watching for?
I'd say pay close attention to how they handle the smelter situation. Can they get it back online quickly? Do they face any further disruptions or, regulatory headaches? That's going to be a key indicator of their ability to navigate that Indonesian landscape.
And beyond Indonesia, keep an eye on their execution of those cost reduction plans.
Yeah.
Can they deliver on their promises and become a leaner, more efficient copper producer? Because in a volatile market like this, every penny counts.
Absolutely. And finally, I'd say, watch how these growth projects develop. Which ones get prioritized? Do they face any unexpected delays or cost overruns? Their ability to deliver on these projects will be crucial to their long-term success.
It's like they're juggling all these copper balls in the air.
Yeah.
We'll have to see if they can keep them all from dropping.
Haha, exactly. There's a lot of potential for Freeport, but also a fair amount of risk. It's a classic, high risk, high reward scenario.
So TalkTickers listeners, there, you have it. A deep dive into Freeport McMoran's Q3 2024 earnings call. We covered the highs, the lows, and everything in between. Now it's up to you to decide what it all means for your own investment decisions. But one thing's for sure, copper is going to be a hot topic for years to come. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those insightful questions coming. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the world of finance and investing right here on TalkTickers.